hour on I24 News. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Gaza ceasefire between Israel's government and Hamas appears to be holding. Hamas is claiming victory. After firing hundreds of rockets, some Israelis believe the airstrikes in response were not enough.
And the ceasefire has sparked political fallout. Israel's defense minister just resigned, saying Israel will pay serious damage to national security in the long term.
Yesterday's ceasefire, together with the entire process of reaching an arrangement with Hamas, is a capitulation to terror.
Great Britain and the European Union are now one step closer to their breakup known as Brexit. Prime Minister Theresa May just received her cabinet's approval for the deal.
And in California, in the aftermath of the state's devastating wildfires, the death toll is rising, and a new lawsuit blames the Northern Camp Fire on a major utility company.
From the I24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
A fragile peace appears to have descended on Palestinian militants in Gaza and Israeli forces surrounding the enclave. A ceasefire brokered by Egypt is holding with no reports of rocket fire.
But the ceasefire has caused political fallout. Israel's defense minister has resigned. Avigdor Lieberman says Israel is surrendering to terror and made a serious mistake. I24 News correspondent Maya Bachrach has details.
A surprise? But is it? On Wednesday, Israel's defense minister Avigdor Lieberman announced,
I'm here to announce my resignation from the role of defense minister of the State of Israel.
This after a prolonged inter-cabinet meeting resulting in a ceasefire.
Yesterday's ceasefire, together with the negotiation process with Hamas, is surrendering to terror. There is no other definition for it. What are we doing in practice now as the state is buying short-term quiet at the price of severe injury to national security for the long term.
Just ahead of this, Netanyahu stinging him at the remembrance ceremony for Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion.
At these moments, leadership is not to do the easy thing. Leadership is to do the right thing, even if it is difficult.
The opposition was quick to react, criticizing the state of security in Israel and calling for early elections.
This is how it should be. You fail in office, you resign. There is no security for residents of the South, so the Prime Minister also needs to quit.
The resignation of Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman only highlights the fact that the Netanyahu government is done.
Netanyahu has begun consultations with the heads of the coalition parties and senior Likud members in a bid to stabilize his now extremely vulnerable coalition. It now seems the possibility of early elections are not a matter of doubt, just a matter of time.
And that was Maya Bachrach reporting. Let's go live to our I24 News diplomatic correspondent, Eli Hachenberg in Tel Aviv. And Eli, on that last point, given that Avigdor Lieberman pulls his party out of the coalition, will this force Prime Minister Netanyahu to call for early elections?
Well, not necessarily, David. His closest circles indicated in the last couple of hours that Netanyahu's tendency, at least at this point in time, is to try and keep this coalition together. In the last couple of hours, he's been talking to all coalition heads, but one, a very important one, a hawkish leader, Naftali Bennett, leader of the Jewish Home Party, who set an ultimatum, essentially, earlier in the day, saying if the defense portfolio is not coming to me, then I'm out of the government. But Netanyahu is consulting with all the rest of the coalition head in a bid to try and keep this coalition together, not because he wants to avoid completely early elections. We already got used to the notion of early elections, but because he's simply not willing to let Avigdor Lieberman to dictate the timetable and certainly not the topic for early elections. Security, not a convenient topic to head out for early elections for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So for now, he's trying to keep this coalition together.
Ellie, so Lieberman today appears as a guy loyal to his principles, stand behind his word. How is it all playing out, his announcement across Israel today among the public?
Wental, I think it's important to know that when we look at the bigger picture, it's not really a surprise. I know it is easy to say it in retrospect, but it does make sense for Lieberman to try and opt out, because if we're looking at his political situation, all recent polls indicate that his hawkish Israel Beitenu is barely making it into parliament, really touching the thresholds, and not much significant legislation on behalf of his party, nothing to really show his electoral base. We did see a very public feud with the second hawkish element in Netanyahu's government, if you will, Naftali Bennett, that we've just mentioned, who is more right-wing. Lieberman was not necessarily winning in this fight. Rising public discontent, especially among right-wing voters, over the policy or lack thereof in Gaza, and impending elections anyway. So it was really reasonable political choice on behalf of Lieberman to try and salvage his political image. So it is playing out quite well for him in terms of making himself a relevant political figure again.
And Ellie, real quickly, how do the polls suggest Israelis across the border are receiving the ceasefire?
Well, not so good. Very bad news for Prime Minister Netanyahu. Actually, a lot of discontent among Israelis. We're seeing some difficult numbers. No less than 74% of Israelis are unsatisfied with Netanyahu on security matters, while just 17 are indeed satisfied. In another survey tonight, 65% of Israelis think Netanyahu's handling of Hamas is either bad or very bad. So not a good image for Netanyahu this evening, David and Tal.
Ellie Hachenberg, our I24NEWS diplomatic correspondent, reporting live from Tel Aviv. Ellie, thank you.
Thank you.
And to discuss it further, let's bring in Joel Rubin, national security strategist and president of the Washington Strategy Group. Joel, what do you think is the right approach here? The one that the Israeli government is taking of a ceasefire with Hamas, or is Lieberman correct when he's saying that this might endanger Israel in the future, in the long run, and also harm its power of deterrence?
Well, certainly Avigdor Lieberman has made a very effective, opportunistic move to leave the coalition government right now. But the truth of the matter is that we have seen this before many times, where Israel and Hamas have been fighting between Gaza and southern Israel. Time and again, Israel has said they would eradicate Hamas. Hamas has said the same, and there's been a stalemate. What we're really at in the big picture is the natural endpoint, in many ways, of a failure of policy by Israel towards the Palestinians and by the Palestinians towards Israel. And this war of attrition on the Gaza border is really not going to change anytime soon unless there's a different approach towards the relations between the two sides.
But, Joel, isn't it fair to say that Israelis in general are becoming more hawkish, less interested perhaps in long-term solutions, more interested in perhaps a more aggressive military response against Hamas?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you could say that about both sides. Right now, the Palestinians do not see a pathway towards a peace agreement with Israel. The Israeli population sees nothing but misery coming from the Palestinians. And so both sides are essentially in a finger-pointing phase. There's no negotiations. There's no third way, middle ground, diplomatic track to ease these tensions. So both sides are essentially becoming more calcified and more dug in their positions. But it's not as if their positions are going to somehow be victorious and defeat the other side totally and completely and then move on. We're going to be stuck in this tit for tat for quite some time, it appears.
And Joel, what do you think, just briefly, about the position that Prime Minister Netanyahu is now at? Because the Israeli voters who elected him again and again voted for a right-wing government, and they feel today that their Prime Minister is acting as if he is a part of a left-wing government.
Well, Netanyahu sort of is caught between two sides and doesn't have really a full position on either. He clearly is disappointed his right-wing supporters. He has gone against what they want, and he at the same time has not engaged the left and the centrist parties in Israel and pulled them into a coalition government to really govern from the center. So he really is leaving himself in a no man's land where he doesn't really have a base to the left or the right. He has to make some hard decisions about where he wants to take Israel. If he wants to go towards the right, he needs to really be aggressive in that way, but he understands there are limits to it. And if he wants to go to a more diplomatic track and a little bit more to the left, he has to pull in some partners from the left so that he has a more stable coalition and a better politics behind him for that than he currently does.
National security analyst Joel Rubin. Joel, thank you for coming on. We appreciate it. When we come back, we will have more on the sharp differences in reaction to the ceasefire agreement. Palestinians took to the streets to celebrate, while some Israelis lit fires in protest. We will take a closer look at the real winners and losers in this deal.
And Brexit is coming, with the March deadline inching closer for Britain to leave the European Union. It appears both sides are closer to an agreement.